The solicitor's office smelled of furniture polish and old paper, and Eleanor Whitcombe sat very still while three people decided what her 22 years of marriage had been worth. She had dressed carefully that morning, the way her mother had taught her, navy, plain, nothing that begged. Across the polished table, Marcus sat beside his own solicitor and beside her, close enough that Eleanor could smell the new cologne. Younger, sharper, the kind of scent a man wore when he had decided he was beginning again. "My client is being more than generous," Marcus's solicitor said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "Given the circumstances." The circumstances, Eleanor almost smiled. The circumstances were that Marcus had built Whitcombe Property Developments from a single converted barn into a portfolio worth £11 million, and that everyone in this room believed he had done it alone. They believed Eleanor had spent 2 decades arranging flowers and hosting dinners and raising their daughter, and that her contribution to the marriage could be measured in the value of a house she would now have to leave. She read the sheet. The London flat Marcus's, the portfolio Marcus's, the house in Surrey where she had planted every tree in the garden Marcus's to be sold, the cars, the savings, the shares. His, the lawyers had been thorough. At the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, was the single line they had thrown her like a coin to a beggar. Hartsmoor Field, Devon, approx. 40 acres, transferred to Mrs. Whitcombe. "Hartsmoor," Eleanor said quietly. It was the first word she had spoken in 20 minutes. Marcus shifted in his seat. "It's the dead land, El. The bit my father left me that nobody could ever do anything with. I thought you might like it. Sentimental value." He had the grace, at least, to not quite meet her eyes. "The agricultural surveyor said it won't even take grazing. Soil's wrong. It's 40 acres of nothing." His solicitor cleared his throat. "It does come with a small liability for boundary maintenance, but Mr. Whitcombe is prepared to." "I'll take it," Eleanor said. The room paused. Her own solicitor, a kind, tired man named Price who had clearly expected her to fight, looked at her with something close to alarm. "Mrs. Whitcombe, I'd strongly advise we contest the—" "I'll take it," she said again. She signed her name in the 3 places they showed her, and she did not let her hand shake until she was alone in the lift afterwards, watching the floor numbers descend, feeling the whole architecture of her old life dissolve behind the steel doors. What none of them knew, not Marcus, not the solicitors, not the younger woman waiting for him somewhere across the city, was that Eleanor Whitcombe had spent the first 9 years of her adult life, before she ever met Marcus, as a field geologist for the British Geological Survey, and that she had known about Hartsmoor for a very long time. She drove to Devon 2 days later, the boot of her aging estate car packed with everything she had been permitted to keep. The motorway gave way to A roads, the A roads to lanes, the lanes to a track so narrow the hedgerows brushed both wing mirrors at once. When the track finally opened, it opened onto Hartsmoor. It was, by any ordinary measure, a desolate place. 40 acres of pale, stony, acid ground rising toward a low ridge, with a derelict stone cottage hunched at its eastern edge and a single skeletal oak standing sentinel in the middle distance. Nothing grew there but gorse and a thin scurf of heather. The agricultural surveyor had been right. You could not graze it, could not plow it, could not coax a crop from it. The soil chemistry was hostile to almost everything. Eleanor stood in the wind with her arms wrapped around herself and felt, for the first time in months, something other than grief. Because the very thing that made the soil hostile to farming was the thing she had come for. She had walked land like this before, years ago, in another life, with a hammer in her hand and a hand lens on a string around her neck. The cottage was barely habitable, a leaking roof, no heating beyond a wood burner, a kitchen from the 1970s. She moved in anyway. She had £90,000, the entirety of her settlement once the legal fees were paid, and she was 46 years old, and she had decided she would either prove herself right or she would lose everything trying. There was a strange freedom in having so little left to lose. In the village 3 miles down the valley, she became a small curiosity. The divorced woman who had been given, the rumor corrected itself, the dead land at Hartsmoor. She bought her bread and her milk at the village shop and said little. The locals decided she was either eccentric or broken, and either way not worth the trouble of knowing. Eleanor let them think it. She had spent 22 years being seen as Marcus's wife. Being seen as nothing at all was almost restful. What she did in those first weeks, she did alone and at dawn when no one was watching. She walked the 40 acres in a careful grid, the way she had been trained, and she took samples. Soil from the eastern slope, soil from the ridge. Fragments of the pale rock that broke the surface like bone through skin. She labeled each sample in her small, precise handwriting and stored them in the cottage's back room. And at night, by lamplight, she examined them with the equipment she had kept all these years in a locked case Marcus had never once asked about. She was looking for something specific. She had been looking for it, in a sense, for 23 years. To understand why, you would have to go back to the summer Eleanor was 23, when she was a junior geologist on a regional survey team mapping the mineralization of the Southwest. It had been the best summer of her life, long days in the field, her boots wet to the ankle, her notebooks filling with the small, ecstatic shorthand of someone who has found her calling. Their team leader had been a brilliant, exacting man named Dr. Anthony Hale, who taught her to read a landscape the way other people read faces. And it had been Hale who, one evening over their camp stove, had shown her a set of readings from a stretch of unremarkable acid ground near a place called Hartsmoor, and said, almost to himself, "There's something here. The geochemistry's all wrong for the surface story. Something's hiding underneath." He had circled it on the map. And then, 3 days later, the survey's funding had been cut. The team had been dissolved, and Eleanor had gone south to look for work and met a charming young property developer named Marcus Whitcombe in a pub in Exeter. And the circled map had gone into a drawer, and the drawer had become a marriage, and the marriage had become her whole life. She had never forgotten the circle, and she had never, not once in 22 years, told Marcus that the worthless land his father owned was the very land Dr. Hale had circled. It had been hers, a small private thing, the last surviving fragment of the woman she had been before she became someone's wife. She had kept it the way some people keep a first love secret. And when the divorce came, and Marcus offered her Hartsmoor as a sentimental consolation prize, a joke at her expense, she had understood with perfect clarity that he was handing her the one thing in his entire portfolio that might be worth more than all the rest of it combined. She just had to prove it. The samples confirmed what she had suspected within the first month. The soil chemistry, the trace elements, the particular signature of weathering on the surface rock, it all pointed to the same thing Hale's instruments had whispered 23 years before. There was a mineralized structure beneath Hartsmoor, a vein system running down into the ridge, and the surface geochemistry suggested it carried gold. Not the romantic gold of riverbeds and pans, but the real and serious kind. An ore body, locked in quartz and sulfides, the kind that built mines and fortunes. But suspecting was not proving, and proving would cost money Eleanor did not have. To confirm an ore body, you needed to drill, to send a diamond-tipped core down through the rock and pull up a long cylinder of the Earth's interior and assay it in a laboratory. A single proper drilling program could cost more than her entire settlement. So Eleanor did what she had always done. She was patient, and she was thorough, and she did the work nobody else was willing to do. Through that first autumn and winter, she mapped every inch of Hartsmoor at a level of detail that would have made Dr. Hale proud. She trenched the surface by hand where she could, breaking the frozen ground with a mattock until her palms bled and healed and hardened. She built a geological model of the subsurface from the evidence she could gather without drilling, the strike and dip of the rocks, the pattern of the surface mineralization, the way the trace elements concentrated toward one particular point on the eastern slope. And slowly, on the wall of the cottage's back room, a picture emerged, a model of where the vein would be richest and how deep and how large. It was, she estimated, conservatively, somewhere between 40 and 90 million pounds of gold. She told no one. She had learned, over 22 years, exactly what happened when a woman's quiet competence collided with other people's confident assumptions. She intended, this time, to be holding all the cards before anyone at the table even knew there was a game. The trouble began, as trouble so often does, with a letter. It arrived in March, official and crisp, from a company called Meridian Resources plc. Eleanor knew the name. Meridian was one of the larger minerals exploration firms in the country, the sort that held licenses across half the Southwest and employed teams of geologists to do precisely the kind of work she had done alone. The letter was polite, formal, and entirely transparent in its purpose. Meridian, it said, held the mineral exploration rights across a wide area that included the land at Hartsmoor. They were aware that she had recently acquired the surface title. They wished to inform her that they intended to commence an exploration program in the coming months, and they trusted she would understand that mineral rights and surface rights were, in English law, two separate things. Eleanor read the letter 3 times in the cold kitchen, and then she sat very still for a long while. She had made a mistake, not a fatal one but a serious one. In her certainty about the geology, she had failed to fully investigate the law. In England, the ownership of the land's surface did not automatically include the minerals beneath it. The two could be, and often were, owned separately. And somewhere in the long history of Hartsmoor, perhaps when Marcus's father bought it, perhaps generations before, the mineral rights had been severed from the surface and sold, and they had ended up, through some chain of corporate acquisitions, in the hands of Meridian Resources. Eleanor owned 40 acres of barren field. Meridian owned the gold beneath it. A lesser woman, or simply a more defeated one, might have given up then. Eleanor made a pot of tea and got out a fresh notebook and began, methodically, to find out exactly what she was dealing with. What she found, over the following weeks of careful research in the county record's office and the obscure corners of the internet where corporate filings are kept, was both worse and better than she had feared. Worse, because Meridian's claim to the mineral rights was real and recent. The company had acquired a parcel of old severed mineral rights across Devon 2 years earlier, in a job lot, for almost nothing, the kind of speculative purchase that exploration companies make all the time, betting that one parcel in 50 might prove worth something. They almost certainly did not yet know what lay beneath Hartsmoor specifically. They were planning a broad reconnaissance program across all their new holdings. Better because of who ran Meridian Resources. The company's exploration division was headed by its chief executive, a man named Gerald Ashworth, and as Eleanor read about him, the trade interviews, the investor presentations, the smiling photographs at industry awards, a cold recognition settled over her. Gerald Ashworth had been, 23 years ago, the regional manager whose budget decision had cut the funding for Dr. Hale's survey team, the man who had dissolved her first and best life with a stroke of a pen. He would not remember her. She had been a junior geologist beneath his notice, but she remembered him. And she remembered, too, something Hale had said about him the night the team broke up bitterly over the last of the camp whiskey. Ashworth doesn't find anything, Hale had said. He acquires what other people find and he takes the credit, and he's never once in his life put a hammer to a rock. Men like him don't discover gold. They wait for someone else to discover it, and then they own it. Eleanor closed her laptop and looked at the wall of her back room, at the careful map of everything she had discovered alone in the cold with bleeding hands. And she understood, with the same clarity she had felt in the solicitor's office, exactly what was about to happen. Meridian would send a reconnaissance team. The team would take samples, far cruder than hers, but enough. They would find the same signature she had found. And Gerald Ashworth, who had never put a hammer to a rock, would own the gold beneath her field and take the credit for finding it, and Eleanor would be left, once again, with 40 acres of nothing. Unless she was cleverer than he was, which she thought, with the first real smile she had smiled in a year, would not actually be very difficult. The reconnaissance team arrived on a wet morning in April. 2 young geologists in a mud-spattered Land Rover, polite and faintly apologetic, with a permit that entitled them to access the land for sampling. Eleanor met them at the gate with a flask of tea, which surprised them, and she watched them work with the patient interest of a teacher observing students. They were not very good. That was the first thing she noticed, and it gave her a quiet professional satisfaction. They sampled in a hurried grid, missing the eastern slope almost entirely, taking their soil from the wrong horizon, mistaking a band of barren quartz for the structure they were looking for. They would find something, she judged, enough trace anomaly to flag Hartsmoor as of interest and warrant a return, but they would badly misjudge the size and location of the ore body. They would think it was a minor occurrence on the ridge. They would have no idea that the real prize lay 40 meters down the eastern slope, exactly where she had mapped it. "You've an interest in geology, then?" one of them asked, when she answered a question about the local rocks a little too precisely. "A little," Eleanor said, "from a long time ago." She gave them their tea and their biscuits, and she watched them drive away with their flawed samples, and she did not tell them a single thing they had got wrong. Information, she had learned, was the only real currency she possessed. She did not intend to give it away for free. That evening she made 2 telephone calls. The first was to a former colleague from the British Geological Survey, a woman named Priya Chandra who had stayed in the profession while Eleanor's life took its long detour, and who now ran an independent geological consultancy. They had not spoken in 2 decades. Priya, to Eleanor's quiet relief, remembered her at once and listened without interrupting for nearly an hour. "Eleanor," Priya said at the end slowly, "if your model is even half right, this is one of the more significant onshore gold discoveries in this country in a generation. You understand that?" "I understand that." "And you've done all this alone, by hand?" "I've had a lot of time," Eleanor said, "and no one watching me. It's remarkable what you can do when nobody expects anything of you at all." The second call was to a solicitor, not poor tired Mr. Price, who handled divorces, but a specialist in mineral and mining law whom Priya recommended. Eleanor spent the last of her settlement money on 3 hours of his time, and at the end of it she understood her position completely, in all its difficulty and all its hidden strength. She did not own the gold. That was the hard truth, and she did not flinch from it. But she owned the surface, every acre of it, including the only viable access, the only ground on which a mine could be built, the only route by which a single ounce of ore could ever be moved. Meridian could own the gold for 1,000 years, and it would do them no good whatsoever if they could not reach it, and they could not reach it without her. In law, the holder of mineral rights had certain entitlements to access, but those entitlements were limited, contested, and enormously expensive to enforce against an uncooperative surface owner who knew exactly what she was doing. The gold was Meridian's, but the door to it was Eleanor's, and she held the only key. She did not have long to plan her move, because Gerald Ashworth made his first one within the month. The reconnaissance samples had come back, as she had predicted, flagging Hartsmoor as a site of interest. But Ashworth, it transpired, was a more careful reader of his own data than his sloppy field team deserved, and something in the numbers had caught his attention. He came to Devon himself. Eleanor knew it was him before he reached the gate. She watched the dark green Range Rover pick its way up the track, and she felt 23 years fall away, and she went out to meet him in the same navy coat she had worn to her divorce. He was older than his photographs, heavier, with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent his life persuading people to sell him things cheaply. He did not recognize her. Why would he? "Mrs. Whitcombe," he said, extending a hand. "Gerald Ashworth, Meridian Resources. I do hope I'm not intruding. I happen to be in the area and I thought it only courteous to introduce myself, as we're to be neighbors of a sort." "Of a sort," Eleanor agreed and shook his hand and did not offer him tea. He walked her land as though he already owned it, his eyes moving over the ground with the dull greed of a man calculating. He talked, pleasantly, of the inconvenience of these old severed mineral rights, of how awkward it was for everyone when surface and minerals fell into different hands, of how much simpler life was when sensible people came to sensible arrangements. And then, having softened the ground as he imagined it, he made his offer. Meridian, he said, would like to purchase the surface title to Hartsmoor outright. It would simplify matters enormously. He understood the land had no agricultural value whatsoever, quite worthless, really, for any normal purpose, and so the company was prepared to be generous. He named a figure, £70,000. It was, Eleanor noted, slightly less than she had paid for the land in the divorce, by virtue of having received it for free. He was offering to buy her out of the single most valuable thing she had ever owned for £70,000, and he was doing it with the comfortable confidence of a man who had no idea that the woman in the navy coat had mapped his ore body more accurately than his entire company ever would. "That's very generous, Mr. Ashworth," Eleanor said. "I'll need to think about it." A flicker of impatience crossed his face, quickly mastered. "Of course, take your time, though I should mention in fairness that our exploration program will proceed regardless. We do hold the mineral rights, and the law is rather firmly on our side regarding access. I'd hate for you to find the process disruptive. A clean sale really is the simplest outcome for everyone." He smiled. "For a woman on her own out here, I'd have thought a clean break and a fair price would be rather welcome." There it was, the assumption, naked and certain. A woman on her own. A woman to be managed, pitied, and moved gently off the board. Eleanor smiled back, and said nothing at all, and let him drive away believing he had frightened her. She had not been frightened, she had been thinking. Ashworth's threat was real, but it was also a bluff, and she understood the difference. The law of mineral access in England was genuinely on Meridian's side in principle, but in practice, enforcing access against a determined and knowledgeable surface owner could take years and cost a fortune in legal fees, and exploration companies lived and died on the patience of their investors. Ashworth did not want a 5-year court battle over access rights. He wanted Hartsmoor cheap and quiet and quick, before anyone, including his own shareholders, understood what was really there. His impatience was his weakness. It always had been. It was the same impatience that had cut Hale's funding rather than wait for results. And there was something else. As Eleanor researched Meridian Resources more deeply, with Priya's help she began to see the shape of the company's true position. Meridian was overextended. It had borrowed heavily to acquire its sprawl of speculative licenses. Its share price had been sliding for 18 months, and it badly, urgently needed a discovery, a real one, a flagship project, to reassure its lenders and lift its stock. Ashworth was not a confident predator toying with prey. He was a desperate man who had bet his company on finding gold somewhere, and who had just realized, from a set of reconnaissance samples, that it might be sitting under 40 acres of Devon owned by a divorced woman he assumed he could buy for the price of a modest car. He needed Hartsmoor far more than Eleanor needed £70,000. He simply did not know that she knew it. So Eleanor declined his offer politely, by letter. And then she began, quietly, to build the position from which she would negotiate not as a victim, but as the single most important person in Gerald Ashworth's entire future. The next 4 months were the hardest and the most satisfying of her life. With Priya's consultancy behind her, working at first on credit, on the strength of Eleanor's data and Priya's professional judgment that the data was sound, Eleanor assembled what she could not have assembled alone. They commissioned a proper geophysical survey, the company taking a stake in the outcome in lieu of fees. the instruments confirming in days what Eleanor had spent a year inferring by hand. A substantial mineralized structure, exactly where her map said it would be, larger than even she had dared to estimate. They prepared an independent geological report to professional standards, the kind of document that a stock exchange would recognize, that lenders would trust, that could not be waved away as the fantasy of a woman with a notebook. And crucially, Eleanor secured her surface position with the precision of someone who had read every relevant statute and case. She granted no access. She made no concessions. She put on record, formally and in writing, that any attempt to develop a mine on Hartsmoor would require the cooperation of the surface owner, and that this cooperation was not for sale at any price that did not reflect the true value of what lay beneath. Meanwhile, Gerald Ashworth grew increasingly agitated. His letters arrived more frequently and less politely. The offers crept upward, 100,000, then 150, each one accompanied by veiled threats about the inevitability of the company's access rights and the foolishness of a surface owner who failed to take a fair price. Eleanor declined them all. She could feel his desperation rising through the increasingly strained courtesy of his correspondence, and she understood that every refusal tightened the screw. He could not proceed without her. He could not abandon Hartsmoor without admitting to his lenders that he had nothing. He was trapped between a discovery he could not reach and a collapse he could not survive, and the only person who could free him was a woman he had dismissed as a problem to be managed. By August, Meridian's share price had fallen far enough that the financial press began to write about the company's troubles, and it was then that Gerald Ashworth made his catastrophic mistake. He decided to force the issue. Rather than continue to negotiate with a woman he could not understand, he applied to the courts for an order compelling access to Hartsmoor under the mineral rights, and this was the fatal part. He announced to his shareholders, in an attempt to steady the falling share price, that Meridian had identified a significant gold prospect in Devon and was moving to development. He did it to buy time and confidence. He did it because he was drowning. And he did it without securing the surface rights first, which meant he had just told the entire investment world that the most valuable asset on his books was a project he had no legal way to develop. Eleanor read the announcement in the financial pages, sitting in the cold kitchen at Hartsmoor with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she understood that Gerald Ashworth had just handed her everything. Because now it was public. Now Meridian's lenders, its shareholders, the financial press, and the regulators all knew that the company's salvation depended on a gold prospect in Devon. And now anyone who cared to look, and Eleanor made certain, through Priya's professional contacts and a carefully placed conversation with a sympathetic mining journalist, that the right people looked, could discover the single inconvenient fact that Gerald Ashworth had been so confident he could bury. That Meridian did not own the surface of that land. That the surface was owned by a woman he had tried to buy out for £70,000. That without her cooperation, the flagship discovery he had announced to save his company was worth precisely nothing, and that his court application to force access could take years he did not have. The story broke in early September. Mining firm's Devon Gold hopes hinge on field owned by divorcee it tried to buy out. The financial press, which loved nothing so much as a tale of corporate arrogance meeting its match, fell upon it gleefully. Meridian's share price, already weak, went into free fall. The company's lenders, alarmed, demanded answers. And the board of Meridian Resources, which had trusted Gerald Ashworth's confident assurances that the Hartsmoor matter was in hand, began, very rapidly, to ask precisely how their chief executive had managed to stake the company's future on land he did not control and could not acquire. The end, when it came at a place Eleanor had not expected to find herself, the boardroom of Meridian Resources, in a glass tower in the city of London, 200 miles from the cold cottage at Hartsmoor. She had been invited, summoned, almost by the board itself, who had at last understood that the woman they needed to deal with was not the obstacle Gerald Ashworth had described, but the holder of the only key to their survival. Eleanor wore the navy coat. She brought Priya and the specialist solicitor and a slim leather folder containing the independent geological report, the geophysical survey, the formal mapping, and the complete, professionally documented model of the ore body beneath Hartsmoor. The work of a year, done alone, by hand in the cold. Gerald Ashworth was there. He recognized her now. She watched the recognition arrive on his face as she sat down across the long table, not the recognition of the junior geologist from 23 years before, but the recognition that the woman in the navy coat, the woman on her own, the woman he had tried to buy for £70,000, had outmaneuvered him so completely that the board of his own company had brought her to London to negotiate his replacement. The chairman of the board, a careful grey man named Sir David Renton, opened the folder Eleanor had placed before him and turned the pages slowly, and as he turned them the room grew very quiet. He was a man who knew how to read a geological report, and what he was reading was the most thorough, most professional, most damning document anyone at that table had ever seen damning, because it revealed not only the true size of the gold deposit, far larger than Meridian's own crude reconnaissance had suggested, but also, by implication, the staggering incompetence of the team that had so badly misjudged it. "Mrs. Whitcombe," Sir David said at last, removing his spectacles, "this is, forgive me, this work, who prepared this?" "I did," Eleanor said. "The geophysical survey was carried out by Dr. Chandra's consultancy to confirm my model, but the mapping, the geochemistry, the structural interpretation, that was my own work. I have been a geologist for rather longer than I was anything else." She let that settle. "Before I was Mrs. Whitcombe, I worked for the British Geological Survey. I surveyed this region. In fact," and here she allowed herself, for the first time, to look directly at Gerald Ashworth, "I was on the team whose funding Mr. Ashworth cut, 23 years ago, 3 days after our team leader identified an anomaly at Hartsmoor that nobody at Meridian has managed to correctly characterize since." The silence that followed was the most complete Eleanor had ever heard. Ashworth's face had gone the color of the pale stone in her field. That is entirely beside the point," he managed. "The mineral rights belong to Meridian. The gold is ours. This woman owns a field, a barren field that I personally offered to purchase at a fair." "You offered £70,000, Eleanor said quietly, "for the surface rights to a gold deposit worth, on the figures in that report, somewhere in excess of 60 million. You announced a discovery to your shareholders that you had no legal means to develop, and you did all of it because you assumed that a woman on her own in a cottage in Devon could not possibly understand what she was sitting on." She folded her hands. "I understood it before your company existed." The arrangement that followed was not, in the end, a battle, because there was nothing left to fight. The board of Meridian understood their position with the cold clarity of men watching their company's survival depend on a single negotiation. They could spend years and millions in court trying to compel access across Eleanor's land, with no guarantee of success and every guarantee of further collapse in their share price while they did it. Or they could come to terms with the only person who could make the project real. They came to terms. Eleanor did not, in the end, take a simple payment, because she had not done all of this for a payment. She structured an agreement that gave her a substantial founding equity stake in the project, a seat on its steering committee, and the condition she insisted upon above all others, the condition that made Sir David look at her with something close to awe, full control over how the mine would be developed. Because Eleanor did not intend to gouge a wound in the Devon hills and walk away rich. She intended to build the most carefully, most responsibly developed mine in the country, on the land that had been handed to her as a joke, and to do it properly, the way Dr. Hale had taught her, all those summers ago. Gerald Ashworth was not part of the new arrangement. The board, which had at last understood the full scale of his recklessness, the unauthorized announcement, the failure to secure access, the offer to sell their salvation cheaply out of arrogance and haste, asked for his resignation within the week. He left the glass tower carrying a single box, and the financial press which had built him up took particular pleasure in the symmetry of his fall. The man who, as Hale had said, had never once put a hammer to a rock, who had spent his whole life acquiring what other people discovered, had been undone at last by the one discovery he could not acquire, because the woman who had truly discovered it had been one step ahead of him from the beginning, and had simply waited, with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose, for his own pride to destroy him. There is a photograph, taken some 18 months later, that hangs now in the small site office at Hartsmoor. It shows Eleanor Whitcombe standing at the head of the first exploratory adit, in a hard hat and muddy boots, her hand resting on the cool stone of the hillside. She is not smiling for the camera. She is looking at the rock with the expression of a woman who has come home. Marcus had telephoned once when the story broke. He had read about it in the papers, of course, everyone had. The barren field, the joke consolation prize, the 40 acres of nothing that had turned out to be the most valuable thing in the entire divorce. Eleanor had listened to him stammer through his congratulations, his disbelief, the careful probing about whether there might be some arrangement, some recognition that the land had after all once been his. She had let him talk himself into silence. "You gave it to me, Marcus," she had said at last, gently, without cruelty. "You looked at 40 acres of dead ground and you saw nothing, because you have never in your life been able to see what was underneath the surface of anything. That was always the difference between us. I'll send you a copy of the geological report if you'd like. It's rather good." And she had hung up and gone back to her work and not thought of him again for a long time. She did not become, in any obvious sense, a different person. She still bought her bread and her milk at the village shop, though the villagers regarded her differently now, with the wary respect a community reserves for someone it has badly misjudged. She still rose at dawn and walked the land. The cottage acquired a new roof and proper heating, but she did not leave it for anywhere grander. She had not done any of this to become rich, though she had become rich. She had done it to prove to Marcus, to Gerald Ashworth, to every person who had ever looked at her and seen only what she was attached to rather than what she was, that she had been there all along, that the value had been there all along, beneath the surface, in the place no one had bothered to look. On the wall of the site office, beside the photograph, she hung one other thing, an old creased survey map from 23 years before, with a single faded circle drawn around a stretch of unremarkable acid ground, in the hand of a man named Dr. Anthony Hale, who had taught a young woman to read a landscape the way other people read faces, and who had said on the last night of the best summer of her life, "There's something here. Something's hiding underneath." He had been right. It had simply taken 23 years, and a divorce, and a barren field, and a woman patient enough to wait for everyone to underestimate her one final time. The thing about the surface of the earth, Eleanor Whitcombe had learned, is that it tells you almost nothing about what lies beneath it. The same is true of people. The world is forever handing its most valuable things to those who cannot see their worth, and calling them worthless and looking away. And every so often, not often, but sometimes, the one person who was paying attention all along picks up the worthless thing and holds it to the light and waits.